So again, way too late to retake exams 1 and 2, but you can still meet me online to get feedback, get all the correct answers, and a 5% boost to your grade. You're going to need the answers to the first 3 exams because the first 3 exams are your study guide for the final exam. So again, no one's taking that. You just sit there. I explain why your wrong answers are wrong. I give you the right answers. I tell you why they're right. You get a boost to your grade, and it helps you for the final. So any questions about meeting me to get feedback for the old exams? All right, you can still retake exam 3. Let's say you can retake it until the end of the week of Thanksgiving, fall break. That way I have time to meet with you afterwards, again, to give you the correct answers to exam 3 to help you study for the final exam. So just like exams 1 and exams 2, when you retake exam 3, you've got to let me know, otherwise I have no way of knowing that I need to go in there and change your grade. And hopefully some of you guys take me up on retaking exam 1, because very few people took me up on retaking exam 1 and 2. And those same people will probably be the ones asking me at the end of the semester what they can do for their grade. And the answer is nothing, because I'm telling you now all the things you need to do to get your grade fixed before the end of the semester. So any questions about the old exams? All right. Reminder, make sure you check your emails and announcements before you come to class, just in case something comes up and I can't attend and we have to meet online. It'd be good to know that. That way you don't waste your time coming in. Some people came in on Monday, despite the fact that for weeks I've been saying every day, we're not meeting in class on Monday. We're meeting only online. So not only do I need you guys to pay more attention, but maybe if you have classmates, remind them of things that are big, like, hey, remember we're not meeting for class today, right? Any questions about that? Okay, speaking of which, I've received a few emails already. Like I've been saying for over a week, we are not meeting for lab this week. It's not in person. I'll be here if you need me, if you want to work on something else, but it's just a video. I have received some emails, luckily, not luckily, but thank you guys for letting me know. Some people have been having some issues turning in the form for the videos. So I'm gonna look into that. But at least one of the people who looked into it told me they were having issues. I did see their score. So I would love to see what it looks like on your end to help you figure out what's going on. Because again, one of your classmates said, okay, afterwards we'll take a look then. Thanks. Yeah, something's going on with it. It's looking like on your end it's not being submitted, but on my end it is. But we'll fix it. And it's just a video and you have all week. So no rush, no worries with that. So any questions about lab this week? All right, next week we are meeting for lab. It is virtual, so you'll need a computer. And as usual, if you get it done before it comes time to meet, so between now and next week, if you do the next lab, then you don't need to come in. But yes, we are tentatively meeting next week for lab. Any questions about next week's lab? Oh yeah, sorry, there's also no pre-lab this week. So again, next week's lab is virtual, but there's no pre-lab to turn in, right? Nice and easy this week. Any questions about that? All right, attendance is mandatory, participation is graded as usual. If you're here in person right now with me, you need to send in a list of attendance words by 9 a.m. Make sure you include at least one question about the material covered in the lecture. And if you're watching the video at a later date, so not those of you who are streaming right now, but if you're watching a video at a later date, you also need to include screenshots. So again, if you're in person or online live right now, that's what you need to do. Send an email by 9, include the words and a question. And the first word for attendance, this picture right here, it's French dip. Apparently today is National French Dip Day. Anyway, any questions about attendance, participation? All right, so the last announcement, the final exam is due or will be had on Monday, December 8th in this room from 8 to 9:50, and it will be in person. So make sure you're here. You'll need not a screenshot. You'll need a password to get into the exam. If you're not here, you'll have a 0 on the final exam. But anyway, if you can't do it Monday at December 8th, now's the time to tell me. Like within this week, you should let me know. Like, hey, I know I can't be there, or I prefer to do it on a Tuesday because I have a really big exam, a harder exam, Monday afternoon, whatever it may be. Let me know. I am flexible, but you have to let me know. You can't just, I know someone's going to do this. You can't just email me on Monday and say, hey, I can't make it. If you do that, it's a 0, right? If you can't make it, I need to know now so we can plan ahead. Yeah. But anyway, on the final exam, it'll be about 100 questions. About 50 of those are going to come directly from the first 3 exams, which is why I keep trying to get you guys to meet me online to get the correct answers. And then 50 of them will come from the last portion. Everything covered after chapter 3, which is what we're working on now. Or excuse me, after exam 3. Any questions about anything? Any of your own announcements? Okay, let's get into it. Actually, let me take attendance really quickly. Of course, if you're online, you don't need to say anything. Technically, you are not here. This is redundant anyway, but let's do it anyway. Brumfeld is here. Champion is here. Gross is not here. Gunther is here. Both Hills are here. Jackson is not here. Keys not here. Perez is not here. Sigmund is here. Slaughter is not here. Smith is here. Stover is not here. Tompkins is not here. Vanessa is not here. Watson is not here. Young is not here. Zweiback is here. Lawrence is not here. Wilson is not here. Did I miss anybody? There we go. Now we're moving. All right. Back to evolution. Specifically, we were talking about the different types of evolution, right? We talked about genetic drift. You need to know what genetic drift is. You need to know the difference between the 2 types of genetic drift. You need to know what gene flow is. And now finally, we're kind of going back to natural selection very quickly. So we've already talked a lot about natural selection. Now we're just looking at it very quickly, just looking at it from a different perspective. Give you a little additional information that you're going to need to know for these things. So here we go. Remember, there's different types of evolution, right? There's genetic drift, there's gene flow. There's, well, those are the 2 big ones. And then there's natural selection. And it's only natural selection that leads to adaptive evolution. So you need to know that. Of those 3, between gene flow and genetic drift, it's only natural selection that leads to adaptive evolution, meaning it's only natural selection that helps a population become more adapted to the environment they're in, right? Everything else, like genetic drift, is just random. In a sense, gene flow is also kind of random, except it's dictated by genes coming in or out of a population due to immigration, with an I or an M, right? Migration, things coming in and out. But natural selection is the only one that leads to adaptive evolution. What is adaptive evolution? Like I already said, this is the definition definition of it. Evolution that results in a better fit between organisms and their environment. That might be a question. But as usual, I don't like you to memorize and regurgitate stuff. So if you're studying a definition, don't necessarily memorize it verbatim. Understand what it means, then be able to pick it out of a list on the multiple choice exam. A good example is the blue-footed booby. I'll put a big old X through this before we start talking about it, because this is just an example. I don't plan on having any questions. You don't need to memorize anything about this example. But it has a body and a bill that's streamlined like a torpedo that minimizes frictions as it dives. So the way it gets its food, generally speaking, flies around really high over the ocean. It's looking for fish that it can grab. Once it sees it, kind of nose dives into the water and it grabs it. And again, it's because of natural selection, it's built for that, right? It's streamlined like a torpedo, meaning once it hits the water, it can hit the water and get in quickly and move quickly and get the fish, right? Be able to eat. However, obviously it's a bird, so being underwater too long is not good because birds can't breathe underwater. So it also needs a way to stop itself from getting too deep so it doesn't die. That's where the large tail functions or comes in, right? So these are all examples of natural selection. It also happens to be a good example of sexual selection, which we'll officially talk about later. But really quickly, I just want to throw that out there since we're talking about the blue-footed booby anyway. The females prefer the males that have the brightest, bluest feet. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I do, or point this out, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on that link and watch another little short video about natural selection. But here's what a blue-footed booby looks like. See, it's very streamlined. It's meant to dive underwater and get fish. But again, the blue feet. Again, we'll talk about sexual selection officially later, but really quickly, since we're talking about this anyway. Yeah, females prefer males with the bright blue feet, which does have, even though it is sexual selection, it does have a natural selection component to it, as it often does when it comes to sexual selection. Because in this case, when females are looking for bright blue feet, right, obviously there's no direct advantage when it comes to survival of having bright blue feet. So you would think, what's that have to do with natural selection? But if the bird is healthy, it doesn't have parasites, and it's well fed, right, that's when it's going to have the bright blue feet. So even though a female booby It's not looking at that thinking, now that's a healthy male. I'd like to procreate with that male, right? It's just attracted to blue feet. But that's why. So very often that's like kind of that relationship between sexual selection and natural selection. But anyway, any questions about that? All right. So like I said, I'll back up one slide before we go forward. Only natural selection leads to adaptive evolution, and adaptive evolution is evolution that results in a better fit between organisms and their environment. So let's talk about what that means. What do I mean by fit, right? And in some ways, you probably already know what I mean. Like if I say somebody is fit outside of a biology class, that person's very fit. You would probably know what that means. And this is slightly related. Relative fitness. So here's a word you need to know for the exam. It is the contribution that an individual makes to a gene pool relative to the contributions of other individuals. Basically, it's like saying, hey, how much are you procreating compared to everybody else in your population? Whether it be a human, a cat, or I don't know, an oak tree, right? This is all basically, again, adding to the gene pool, your genes being added to the gene pool. Which is why I said when we first started this chapter, people very often use the term when they talk about evolution as survival of the fittest. And I don't like that term because the survival is only part of it. You can see here the really important part when it comes to natural selection is this idea of adding to the gene pool. So it's all about reproduction. So any questions about what relative fitness is? All right, next one's going to be pretty simple, I think, the next concept. It's the 3 general outcomes of natural selection. You'll need to know them for the exam. So here we go. And I'm going to use an example for one of them. And again, as always, it's just an example. You don't need to memorize anything about this example. Just understand how the concept works, because that's what you're going to be tested on. So in this example, I'm going to use a population of mice. And if we were to graph the coat color of that population of mice, we would get a bell-shaped curve. And that'll make a lot more sense when I show you the picture. And if natural selection favors one color over the other, then there's going to be only 3 outcomes, and that's what we're going to see. And before I get into it, keep in mind, this is just an example about the mice, but also keep in mind what's going to happen for the exam is I'm going to describe one of these 3 situations, or I might even show you the graph of these 3 situations. Then you have to determine which one it is. So as I'm teaching it, keep that in mind. That's what you're going to need to know. For the exam, I'm going to give you an example of one of them, and you need to recognize it as one of those 3 outcomes. And again, I'll get to the graph eventually, but for now, let's talk about this. That's a little bit hard to read. I apologize, but these are the 3 outcomes. You need to know them, and you need to know the difference between them. And again, for the exam, you need to recognize it. When I give you an example of one, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's an example of one of those 3. So the first one is directional selection. And that shifts the population by selecting in favor of one extreme phenotype. And I think mostly, if I had to guess, so far I think directional selection is the only one I've been even mentioning, even though I've never used that word. I think so far every example I've given you when I've talked about natural selection has been directional selection. So for example, we talked about pesticide resistance in insects, right? Where you put down a bunch of pesticides, kill all the weak ones, and all the strong ones are left. That's a directional selection, right? So you shifted the population from weak, as far as the pesticide is concerned, to strong. The blue-footed booby that we just looked at, right? They've gone from wider to skinnier, right? Skinny is good for them to dive through the water. So that's a directional selection, because there's only 2 phenotypes when it comes to width. You're either wide or you're thin, right? So it's going more towards the thin than the wide. So directional selection, again, that's the one off the top of my head. I think that's the only example I've ever given has been directional selection. But then there's disruptive selection. And this leads to a balance between 2 or more contrasting phenotypes. And again, this is going to make a lot more sense on the next slide when I show you the graph of what I'm talking about. So again, directional selection is choosing one extreme over the other. Disruptive is basically choosing both extremes. So where you get fewer in the middle and more on the extremes. An example of this, a hypothetical example that it's not happening, but it would be very obvious if it was. Imagine, humans. That's if you were to graph humans, the height of humans on it would be a bell curve, right? There's very few people that are very tall. very few people that are very short, and there's a lot of people in between. Now, if something happened, and for some reason there started becoming more and more tall humans and more short humans, but for some reason those average height humans started getting fewer and fewer, that would be disruptive selection, right? So again, you're going towards both phenotypes, in that case, tall and short, but the average would be going down. So any questions about disruptive selection so far? All right, and the opposite sort of disruptive selection is stabilizing selection. So in that case, you're getting fewer of the extremes and more of the average. Again, using the same height example that I just gave for humans, that would be like, all right, I already said there's very few tall people, very few short people, and a lot of average people. In stabilizing selection, there'd be even fewer taller people, and even fewer shorter people, and even more average sized people. So, any questions about these three things before I show you some graphs that hopefully make it a lot more sense? Okay, so here's the example, right? Like I said, this is from the this is a population of mice. This example is from the old textbook, so if you want to look at it, you need to download this PowerPoint. It's not in your textbook. But here we go. Here's a population of mice that have a range of fur color, right? So from white to very dark and everywhere in between, right? This graph shows that there's very few light ones, very few dark ones. And as you get more towards that middle color, there's more and more of it, right? That's what that graph indicates. That's the original population. Now there's three outcomes that can happen in natural selection, one of three. So let's say, for example, these mice live on an island, a volcanic island, and they fit in with the rocks and the sand, right? That's this average color may be very good to help them hide from predators. And then let's say that volcano erupts and a lot of lava comes out. Now you have black stone, burnt stuff everywhere. Now all of a sudden there's an advantage to being dark. So the population is going to shift, right? You're going to have fewer and fewer of the light color and more of the dark color. That would be directional selection. Using the same example, even though it's not on the picture, imagine that same island. There's an ice age, and that island is now covered in snow. Then there would be an advantage to being light instead of dark, and then you would still have directional selection. Except this time it would move this way, right? But either way, as long as you're moving one way or the other, like towards one of the other extremes, that is directional selection. Again, we talked about disruptive selection. This is when you get fewer of the average and more of the extreme. I don't know, using the same example, again, you're on a volcanic island, so there's an advantage to being middle colored. But again, let's say the volcano goes off, so now you've got a bunch of burnt stuff and black stone everywhere. But let's also say there's also an ice age at the same time. So now there's like black stuff and white stuff, but there's not much in between stuff. Therefore, being very dark or very light would have an advantage, or give you an advantage to hide from predators, in which case you would get disruptive selection. A real life example, speaking of which, for any of these, I'm giving you these hypothetical examples. For any of these, for extra credit, you could look up what are some real life examples of directional selection. That's some real life examples of disruptive selection. It's a real life example of stabilizing selection. But anyway, I will give you a real example of disruptive selection just because I think it's slightly interesting. It's called, what is it called? It's not the real name, but the nickname for this situation is they call it the sneaky bastard defense. So there's a population of beetles where the males compete for the females, right, to mate with them. So they go to combat. So there's an advantage to being a large male because then you can, if you win the battle, you get to procreate, right? You get to add your genes to the gene pool. So because of that, you would expect to have directional selection because you're going to have more taller or bigger beetles than smaller ones. And it did do that. It did shift that way. However, the really small male beetles are so small, they get mistaken for females. So while the two big males are fighting each other, the sneaky bastard small male that no one knew was a male sneaks in there, mates with the female while the other males are fighting, and then he's out of there, right? So because of that, that beetle was successful at adding their genes to the gene pool. And because of that, the population has gone into extremes. There's really big ones, so they can be good at fighting each other. And there's really small ones, so they're good at sneaking in there. And there's not many in between. Because if you're in between, you can't sneak in. You can't sneak in there. And if you do get caught, you're probably going to get beat by the larger ones. So anyway, any questions about disruptive selection? Okay. And then stabilizing selection. Again, it's kind of like the opposite of disruptive selection. So stabilizing selection is when you have fewer and fewer of the extreme phenotypes and more of that center phenotype. All right, so my next word for attendance is a question, and it should be very easy. It's on this slide, even though I'm about to leave this slide. What is the example I just gave? What type of animal did I just use as an example to talk about the different types of selection? As the one on the board too, so I'm not talking about the beetle or humans, but the ones on the picture. What kind of animals were those? Anyway, any questions about all that? Okay, now we're going to talk about sexual selection. And like I mentioned earlier, sexual selection, in a way, it's kind of like a subcategory of natural selection, right? So using the blue-footed booby again as an example, it isn't as if having blue feet will give those birds a survival advantage or disadvantage for that matter, but it is an indication that they're doing something well, right? They're healthy, therefore they have bright blue feet, therefore sexual selection makes them more likely to reproduce. But anyway, the definition of sexual selection is individuals with certain traits are more likely than others to obtain mates. It's that simple, right? Some things that go along with sexual selection, as we've already mentioned, even though I didn't use these words yet, intrasexual competition. So when I was talking about those beetles, that was an example of intrasexual competition, because those are two males fighting to mate with a female. And then there's intersexual selection of mates. And that would be an example of that, like the ones we've already talked about would be the blue-footed booby, right? Those females are choosing the males with the brightest blue feet. Which leads us to something called, another term you need to know, sexual dimorphism, which is the distinction in appearance between males and females. So again, that's just like saying, hey, when you look at some species, you can clearly see a difference between the males and the females. Like most birds, for example, like the cardinal. If you see a bright red cardinal, it's probably a male. It's a dull kind of orangish color, probably a female. Even plants. You see big old pine cones on a tree, that's a female pine cone. You see little tiny ones on the same tree, that's a male pine cone. Right? So we have this sexual dimorphism in many things, not just animals. And again, these things are things that are not necessarily directly associated with reproduction or survival, right? So again, the bright color of the male, the blue-footed booby, right? That color is not going to help them survive. If anything, it might be even worse. Because if anything, it might help them stick out, and then the predator will see them and they'll eat. Same thing with all the birds, or not all the birds, but many birds. Again, think about the cardinal. I gave you that example. Imagine a bright red cardinal when it's all snowy out, and you're a predator looking to eat. That's going to be a lot more obvious than a dull colored bird. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on this link and watch another little video about evolution. Let's keep talking about sexual selection here. Some species have secondary sex structures that are used to compete with members of the same sex, right? So, think about certain rams and things like that that have big horns, right? Like I'll show you that on the next picture, right? They use that. Yes, excuse me. They probably do use it for protection against predators, maybe, but often it's used for members of the same sex to compete for the female. Often that too, and I don't know if that's not on there. Even though it's not written, I'll go ahead and tell you that. Usually, in these situations, it's usually the males competing for the females and the females being choosy. And you would want to guess why that is for a little extra credit on your attendance. Why would it be that the females are usually the ones that are being picky and the males being the ones who are competing for the female? What is it?
Just their feathers.
Feathers, yeah, that's so in this, that's a good example of the male competing, right? So it's using, in that case, that one's using its feathers and its secondary structures to say, hey, look at me. And again, like I mentioned earlier, even though that doesn't help it, it is an indication that it's healthy. But why? So whether we're talking about birds or beetles or humans, why is it usually that males are the one doing the competing and females are the one doing the choosing? All right, let me ask you this. Hypothetically, if morals were out the window and you're a male, how many children do you think you could have between, or do you think you could create between now and 9 months from now as a male? A lot, right? I don't even know the number. Like, how many people can you have sex with in a day? How many children could a female create in the same 9 months? One, right? Unless there's, twins or something. And it's the same thing with other animals too. And a lot of well, let's just say animals, right? Because what is it? It's like population. Yeah, male, sort of, yeah. But the point is, like, a male, evolutionarily speaking, is just out to, add its genes to the gene pool. A female doesn't get that option, right? So the female, at the very least, is creating the new offspring, and then depending on the species, might also be taking care of it. So it just makes sense evolutionarily why the female is the one that's choosing, and the male is just like, all right, let me just get some sperm in there any way I can. But anyway, so that's what you need to know. Yeah, that is written there, right? It's usually the females. Anyway, before we move on, again, this is just an example, so I'm not going to ask you any questions about a peacock. But what a great example of sexual selection and how these things don't necessarily add to your survival. And sometimes they actually hurt. Because again, imagine being a peacock like that, living in India, and there's a tiger trying to kill you. You're very big, you're very easy to see, you're probably hard to move around with that big tail. So that's actually hurting your chances of survival probably, but increases your chance of procreating. So anyway, any questions about that slide before I show you a couple pictures for examples? All right, so this picture is, even though it might be hard to see, it's a great example of sexual dimorphism, right? You can see this brightly colored male of the same species and that dull colored female. Again, the male is competing for the female's attention. And then here we have an example of two males competing to mate, right? They're fighting each other. The winner gets to mate. So anyway, that's it for sexual selection. Any questions about that? All right. Again, this PowerPoint is mostly based off the old textbook. The old textbook at the end of every chapter included something called Evolution Connection, which had brought that subject matter of that chapter and brought it back to evolution. Of course, this chapter is about evolution, so that's not very hard. But anyway, as usual, I'm not going to text you about any of that, but it talks about antibiotic resistance, and we've already talked about that. So let's see, 825. Let me at least get us started on the next chapter. And while I'm doing that, does anybody have any questions about anything? All right, so that was it for the evolution chapter. And again, to remind you, if you're studying it in the textbook, your textbook, it is 2 different chapters. And I've combined them into that one PowerPoint. And my PowerPoint was a little bit out of order. Sorry, I'm logging in here. Eventually we'll get there. All right, I guess while I'm waiting for that to load up, I'll just remind you, Fridays is the regular day. We're going to meet here in person as usual. As usual, if you can't make it, you can join us online and watch the video afterwards. Go. There we go. Breathe. Sorry, I couldn't wait. I should have already had this downloaded. I didn't think we were going to go so quickly today. So the next word for attendance is wait. Since you guys are having to sit here and wait for me. So I apologize again for discussion 7, chapter 12, chapter 11. Here we go, finally. Chapter, PowerPoint, chapter 19. Now we're getting into my favorite part of the semester. Not that I expect it to be everybody's favorite. But so far, that's not necessarily true. Even when we get into, or when we just finished evolution, that's really where it all starts. But now it gets even better, in my opinion. Because, starting since after chapter 3, we're finally starting getting into stuff that wasn't cells, right? We're starting to talk about organisms instead of just things that you could only see on a microscope. We're finally talking about things you can see in real life. And that's what this is. Now we're going to talk about population and community ecology. So you already know what a population is, but we're going to say it again once we get into this chapter. And next you're going to learn about a community. You're also going to learn about what ecology is, right? So this will all make sense in a second. Once again, this PowerPoint is mostly based off of the old textbooks, so some of it may be a little bit out of order. Some of the examples might be a little bit different. I'm not going to waste your time even talking about these pictures this time. I'm just going to move forward. Again, this PowerPoint is based off the old chapter, or excuse me, the old textbook. And the old textbook always starts each chapter with like a recent news story that brings that chapter into, real life. Like, hey, why is this relevant to everyday life? So you can read that if you want. I'm not going to ask any questions about it. It's about invasive species, a specific one called lionfish. That hits close to home to me because I lived in the Keys for a while as a kid. So that's where that story took place. Anyway, here's the chapter. Here's what we're going to look at. It actually doesn't look that long, but it's going to be a pretty long, which is why I wanted to jump into it today instead of just calling it quits early. So we're going to talk about an overview of population ecology, right? So just the big picture. Then we're going to start getting into details. I want to talk about population growth models. We'll talk about applications of population ecology, like how does all this information being put to use. And finally, we'll kind of talk about all that and look at it from a different lens, like from the perspective of human population growth. Because again, we're talking about all populations, so we're talking about all living things. But then towards the end, we're going to kind of shift our focus and look at it specifically as humans. So here we go, an overview of population ecology. First, we're going to talk about population density, then age structure, then life tables, then life history traits as adaptations. That's a lot of information. Again, you need to know what this term is. I think I first introduced it to you in the last chapter, but here it is again. Population is a group of individuals of the same species that occupy the same place at the same time, right? They're competing for resources. They're interbreeding, or at least potentially interbreeding. They're influenced by the same environmental factors. So that's the thing. You need to know what a population is. Remember last time I talked about this was in evolution, right? When I told you evolution, when we talked about population in that context, that was, the unit of evolution was a population, right? Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. So you learned what a population is. Now here it is again. And this is important. And try not to think of it as a human, right? Because when you think about humans, you can think about the entire human population on Earth. In a sense, is kind of one population. Since humans can go everywhere, theoretically, we rely on the same resources, right? Some of us are exposed to the same environmental factors. We're definitely, hypothetically, able to breed with pretty much any human on Earth. So try not to think of this from the context of humans yet. Try to think of it as other populations. The example I always give is squirrels, right? The squirrels on WVSU's campus, that's a population, right? They're the same species. They rely on the same resources, right? So if somebody were to come in and cut down all the oak trees on our campus, then all of those squirrels would, they would go hungry because that's a lot of where their food comes from. Meanwhile, there's squirrels, I don't know, in South Charleston. That's a whole different, it's the same species, but it's a different population, right? Because they're not going to be affected if somebody comes in and cuts down all the trees on WVSU's campus. Or what about the squirrels in Georgia, right? Let's talk about squirrels in Georgia of the same species, right? If we have a bad blizzard here in West Virginia, doesn't mean they're going to have one in Georgia, right? So they're not necessarily influenced by the same environmental factors. They're certainly not likely to breed and interact with each other. Some of them are in West Virginia, some of them are in Georgia. So again, population, it is the same species. People always get that part. That part's easy. But keep in mind that it's the same species at the same place at the same time, right? Competing with each other, interbreeding with each other, dealing with the same environmental factors. Knowing that that's what a population is, then now you can understand what population ecology is. Population ecology is concerned with the changes in population size and the factors that regulate it. So that's it, right? When we talk about population ecology, that's like looking at a specific population and you're just studying how it goes up, how it goes down, how it stabilizes, and what are the things that are causing that to happen. What's causing that population to increase or decrease or stay the same. And we have different ways of describing populations. Some of these you're probably already familiar with. Size, I think most people are very familiar with that, right? So usually when people talk about population and they talk about humans, they talk about the size. Like, oh, there's, over 8 billion people on Earth, right? That would describe the size of our population. Then there's age structure. That one's a little bit less intuitive. I don't think many people think about that often, unless they're biologists or maybe criminal justice majors. Maybe any of you criminal justice majors, right? No, well, anyway, think about like the different age structures for humans. There's probably, I would assume, 18 to 25-year-olds probably on the average are doing different kind of crimes than, I don't know, 70 to 80-year-olds. Anyway, we're going to talk about all these separately. Density. That one, I'm sure you're familiar with it, right? So the population density, I think we have, 1.8 million people in West Virginia, but it's not very dense. And I think there might be about the same amount of people in New York City. So imagine all the people in West Virginia squeezed into one city. But anyway, we're just talking about all these separately. Are there any questions so far? Okay, here's some pictures from the old textbook. These are people doing population ecology. We've got this person that's tagged a bear. So they're probably, obviously keeping track of that bear. Where does it go? They probably follow it, and check on its health occasionally. Here we have a researcher collecting data on a puffin and a researcher researching meerkats. So those are just examples. No questions about that. So let's talk about population dynamics. So again, when we're talking about population ecology, that's concerned with how a population goes up or goes down or stays the same and all the things that cause that. So population dynamics is the interaction between the environmental factors that cause that variation in population size. So again, in population ecology, this is what they're concerned with, right? So they're concerned about how the population changes and the things that cause it to do that. Now, here's some new terms. I think they're new. I don't think I've given them to you yet, but you need to know the difference between them. Biotic and abiotic factors. The living and non-living factors. For example, again, using the squirrels on the WVSU's campus, right? So the stray cats on our campus would be a part of that, would be a biotic factor that causes a variation in the population size, right? The stray cats are probably killing some of the squirrels. So that would be a biotic factor that's causing a variation in the population size of those squirrels. An abiotic factor would be all the roads. Or excuse me, all the cars driving by on the road, right? Those are non-living things that are probably also killing some squirrels. And that is, let me give a better example, because at least with cars, you do have humans driving them for now. So a different example would be, I don't know, the climate. So for example, if we had a bad drought for 3 years, and again, a lot of our trees started dying, then the squirrels would have less things to eat, fewer places to hide. That would be an abiotic factor that's affecting the population size, right? The climate is affecting the population size. So make sure you know the difference between biotic and abiotic. That'll come back later in this chapter and then later in the next chapters too. So an important aspect of population dynamics is obviously population growth. So if we're concerned with how living and non-living things are affecting the population size, obviously population growth is a big part of it. And we're going to come back to that idea. For now, that's just like your little introduction. Population growth is important, and later we're going to talk about population growth. This is just a graph, just an example. You don't need to memorize anything about this. This is obviously human population growth. You can see how it's changed since from 1700 until, projected into the future as well. Yeah, this was pretty accurate too. I forget when this was made, but they got it right as far as we did hit 8 billion in 2024. So they projected it and that happened. But anyway, again, we'll talk about human population growth later. Any questions about this slide? All right. Next word for attendance. I'm just going to circle it. I'm not going to say it. But anyway, population ecology plays a key role in applied research. So in case you're wondering, like, well, who cares about population ecology? What's it matter? So we'll talk a little bit about why it matters. It provides information for conservation and restoration projects, which is why I included this picture. It's hard to tell. But can anybody see what that's a picture of? That's okay if you can't. It's a little bit easier to see on here, but not much. It's a coal mine, right? Surface mining. The point here is, these people, generally speaking, these companies have rules that they have to follow set by EPA and the DEP. So they can't just go in there and leave it like that, right? They have to spend money and time and effort to fix it. And that's where population ecology comes in. And not only do they have to fix it, but there's certain rules about how they have to fix it. It's not like they can just leave it like that and say, hey guys, just throw out some grass seed and water. So, there's actually rules they have to consider. To try to restore things to the way they used to be as much as possible, then we need population ecology, right? We need all this information you're about to learn in this chapter. That's the kind of stuff people need to know. Because again, you can't just willy-nilly say, oh, it'll be okay. Let's just let nature take its course. We have to know how to help. It's also used to develop fisheries. That's big in West Virginia, right? I don't know if you guys are from here or if you fish at all, but they stock a lot of lakes and rivers around here with fish. But again, you have to understand population ecology. You can't just say, all right, I'm going to put a bunch of this species of fish into this body of water. Right? You need to know things about, like, all right, how big must those fish be before we release them? What kind of river do they need to be in? How many should we put in there, right? You don't want to put too many because then that'll be overpopulated and most of them will die. You don't want to put too few because the whole purpose is to put a bunch in there, right? So to have the right number of fish, release them at the right time of year, release them at the right age where they're less susceptible to whatever disease maybe, right? So this is all stuff that you need to figure out, and this is part of population ecology. And then on a related note, right, that's used to manage wildlife populations. So again, I put a picture of the deer, or excuse me, an elk right there, because I don't know if you're familiar with this. I guess it's not really that new anymore, but West Virginia has started bringing elk back to the state. Because there used to be elk here naturally. They were all hunted off. So there was zero elk, and now we're bringing them back. But again, you have to understand how their population works. You can't just bring in a bunch of elk and set them free in downtown Charleston, right? You need to know about population ecology to understand how to do it. And then finally, population ecology provides insights into controlling how pests and pathogens spread. So that's also very important. You think about things like Lyme disease or protected crops so we can all eat. Anyway, that's why it's useful. Let's talk about some key aspects of it. The first thing we're going to talk about is the very easy one, population density. Population density is simply the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. So the per unit area, I think you're all very familiar with that one. So with humans, you would say, hey, there's 100 humans per square mile in this area, right? So that's easy. Where people get a little bit confused is when I say volume. So if you're talking about anything that lives in the air or the water or the soil, for example, you wouldn't say per square foot. You will maybe say per cubic meter, right? So you're not looking at 2 dimensions, you're looking at 3. So those are just examples. Like, again, using volume as an example of largemouth bass. You wouldn't say there's, X amount of largemouth bass per square kilometer, right? Because that's square. You've got to look at cubic. It's 3-dimensional. So largemouth bass per cubic kilometer. Oak trees per square kilometer. Nematodes per cubic meter. So on and so forth. Any questions so far? All right, how do we measure it? Again, try not to think in terms of humans, because humans is a lot easier, right? Humans, for the most part, we know every time someone's born, we know every time someone dies. Generally speaking, we know when people immigrate into the country, we know when people exit the country, right? So and we do a census every 4 years, at least in the United States. So don't think about it from human perspectives, think about nature, right? In most cases, it's impractical, if not impossible, to count all the individuals in the population. So, for example, well, I should say that, not for an example yet. Think about if you were to look up online, I bet you could find this answer. Like, how many deer are in West Virginia? How many oak trees are in Kanawha State Forest? Things like that. Someone probably has an answer to that. And it's not that someone's gone out and counted every deer in West Virginia or every oak tree in the Kanawha State Forest, right? That's impractical. That's impossible to do that. But we have different methods to use. Specifically, the ecologists who do this studying, they have different methods to use. So, for example, number of birds' nests, right? So if you're a population ecologist and you're studying a specific population of birds, then you know how many birds live in a nest. So if you see a nest, you can say, all right, there's probably 2 to 5 birds or whatever, right? You'll know how many birds. And you probably already, if you're studying that population, you probably know their territory. So you know, if you see there's one nest, that there's probably this many birds, and there's probably not that many for whatever, whatever radius, right? So you know how many are there, and you know probably there's not any more anywhere around there. Anyway, that's just an example. Another example would be rodent burrows, and you don't have to memorize any of these. These are all just examples. It's just different techniques. So again, if you're studying something like groundhogs, like I think, or prairie dogs, like I'll show you in the next picture, you're not going to go in there and count all the prairie dogs. But if you know their population, when you see one hole, you'll be okay. Based on the fact that there's a hole here, there's probably this many that live in here, from this many to this many, and this is their territory. So if I see this many holes here, there must be this many, right? Termite mounds, there's all kinds of examples. The point is, again, we don't go out and count every creature, every tree, but we have these methods of at least getting a good estimation. So any questions about that slide? Here's a picture of what I'm talking about with the groundhogs, prairie dogs. Kind of hard to see, but again, anybody studying this particular population will understand if there's a hole there, there's probably this many prairie dogs that live in that hole, and therefore you can figure out how many prairie dogs are in that area based on the number of holes. So any questions about population density or how it's studied? All right, the next one, pretty simple as well, population age structure. It's in the name, right? Population age structure. So the age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. Like for example, per capita, West Virginia has more older people than younger people, I think, if I remember correctly. Or like compared to other states, we have a lot of older people. There's it's interesting, there's some college towns, like big college towns, where the people who do the wastewater treatment can tell a difference between when college is in session versus when college is not in session because of the amount of drugs that are in the water. Like, when the young people aren't there, you got a lot of more things like statins that lower cholesterol, things like that. And when younger people are there, you get more things like things that help you with ADHD, right? So they can tell the population age structure of that town based on the chemicals in the water. But anyway, age structure, that's what it is. It provides insight into the history of the population survival. We'll talk about that in the next couple of slides, because that one's going to be sort of important, and you'll see why when I show you on the next slide. Actually, all of the things on the next slide are going to bring all this into it. But yes, it provides insights into a history of the population survival, reproductive success, how the population relates to environmental factors, all that stuff. And this next slide is a great example. So imagine you were studying this population of birds. I forget what kind it is. Like imagine you just now started studying it. You've been maybe studying it for 5 months. So you're collecting all these individuals. You're looking at them, like you're marking them down. So you've taken basically their age, the population, and their age structure. So this is what this graph is, right? So there's like, when you did your study, there was close to 10 1-year-olds. There was no 2-year-olds, no 3-year-olds. There's a whole lot of 4-year-olds, right? Almost near 50 of them. Fewer 5-year-olds, so on and so forth, right? This is how many of each age group there was. Now, if you just now started, you just got there, and you just now started studying this population, you don't have to wait years to figure out these things on the past slide. The history of the population survival, reproductive success, how the population relates to environmental factors. You don't necessarily have to study it for years, because when you have the age structures, you can infer some things, right? So for example, you can see 4 years ago, since there's so many 4-year-olds, something must have been very good for that population. So then you could just go back and look at old, maybe look at climate, things like that. Maybe it was unseasonably cool that year. And then you could be like, oh, wow. So this population must do very well with low temperatures. I'm just using that as an example. Or, if you look back and like, what happened 2 to 3 years ago that also happened 10 years ago? And maybe there was a certain invasive species that was very prevalent in those years. And you're like, wow, that species must be very bad for this bird. because they didn't have any reproduction 2, 3, and 10 years ago. So on and so forth. Those are just examples. The point is, with age structure, you can get a snapshot and still infer a lot of information from years past, right? So in this example, you have 11 years worth of data, even though you just started studying, right? You just now got that population information. But again, you can figure out a lot from it. Any questions about that slide? All right. So we only have 2 minutes left. There's not enough time to get into it. We're done for the day. Don't forget to send the words. Don't forget to send one question about the material covered in this lecture. And I'm going to be here because we're not meeting for lab, but I'll be in here if you need me. At least at first. You guys have a good, well, I was about to say a good week. It feels like a Monday, but it's not. For those of you who do try to do the lab and have issues with it, try to take screenshots for me so I can see what it looks like. Oh, okay, good. Okay. All right. Bear with me. I've got to pull up the grades here. Your Haley's. You've been that assignments? Huh? Is that assignments? Yes. Oh, you were Superman. That's on that. You wrote assignments. Especially the mission assignments. That's what it's missing. Yeah, grade, attendance, commission assignments. Attendance. So keeps me up. Keeps me in school. It's kind of making me mad. Well, I didn't have that, and I know you didn't know. I wanted to understand that, you know. I took this shit right off. He said, "Whoa, I got $20." I want to go back to sleep. That's all I can. What's chilling right now? I see you today. That's it. So next meeting, right? The lab is on Wednesday. Yep. What has it changed? No, I'm reiterating. I'm just making sure. It's virtual, but of course we do it first. There's no way you can do it first. This one, this one it's virtual, but it's easy. Okay. Now, does he need the class? Does he need like the class average or something? Yeah, but there's online for that. So I'm glad to see you looked ahead. So even though we're like where it says class average, if you click it, there's a spreadsheet. So you just put that information on there. Yeah, that's what they done Sunday. Almost there. I did my flu lab last night when I was doing better out 2K. I got sick time this cat food. This cat food is better than me. Sure. All right. Only
This is only class.
Oh, I haven't even done that. So, yeah, well, that's good. It's not, whatever. I don't want to waste any more of your time. So for the assignments, if there's anything missing, you know, you just look at your spreadsheet. Yeah.
What time is your online hours today?
11 to 12.
Yeah, it's really.
I'll be online anyway for lab. Okay.
That's it.
Thanks. Working. You were there. Big relief. What was that? Huh?
Bro, then it told me just new military put something last night. Oh my god, I don't want to die last night.
Huh?
It was like a thank you. Thank you. It was like a little countdown push up thing. Like you do one push up, you come up with these, do this, two, and then you just go up to 10, and then you go back down to 1. I couldn't do that. It's never heard of it.
We're talking about one.
Yes.
You
Oh,
can't
yeah,
do
it's a-
3 push-ups and 3 jumping jacks? You can't.
That's not jumping.
What
jacks.
is it? That's what I'm asking.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
You come with the knees.
The way you just said it felt like my car.
Like, is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
So you're on your, you're pushing up.
You get up off the push-up position, you get on your knees, touch your head, get back down, do 2 push-ups. Get
So
back
you're just-
up, do this shit.
How many push-ups is that?
20, 30, 40, 50, 60.
110. Huh? Is it 110?
Just 113 or 55 and go back down.
So 1 through 10, that's 55. Never knew that.
Unless you ever did a 1 set of 10 and then start right now, it's supposed to be 100.
All right, I can help you.
That's great.
Hey, so which part do you need help with? So you watch video, it looks like, right? All right, I filled it up. Have you done the hypothesis question? So the question's right after the video? Okay. So then the next questions, well, actually, before we even get there, yeah, so, you know, like the questions were saying, do you think your ecological footprint is bigger, the same, or smaller than the world's average?
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Okay. So then I guess
I stopped after question 8. Question 7, I answered. Question 80 down.
all right, so let's see, what was your answer to question 7?
I believe it would be smaller because I have necessities that I did pay for.
Okay, well, you won't lose points for that, but just so you know, it doesn't matter if you pay for it or not. I'm talking about the ecological footprint, doesn't matter who paid for it, right? Like if you, for example, if you have 2 mansions in each state, but you didn't pay for it, you still have 2 mansions in each state, right? So that's still your ecological footprint. Does that make sense? You don't need to change that, but anyway, what I was gonna point out is when you answer the rest of these questions in between 8 and 12, make sure they match what you wrote here. So for example, if you said, actually, what did you say for number 6?
I'm gonna use my ecological thermos over the board.
Okay.
I have to.
But again,
Oh, I don't have to have a reason.
you do have to have a reason, and you're not gonna lose points for it, but just to remind you, it has nothing, I was gonna say nothing to do with your income. Generally speaking, the more income people have, so yeah, you're on the right track. But anyway, what I was getting at is knowing your answer to number 6 and 7. You think your ecological footprint is smaller than everybody, whether the world or the US. So for the rest of the questions, keep that in mind. So for example, question 8 says, if everyone looked like you, how many Earths do you think we need? And it said here that the world average was 1.71. So your answer needs to be smaller than that. Does that make sense? Because here you said you think you're smaller than the world average. Here, I'm telling
Like
you,
how much? Like,
That's up to
like
you.
162. I think a random number.
Yep,
is it?
yep. Yeah, because it's a hypothesis. The only way people lose points on here is if their hypothesis from questions 8 through 12 don't match their hypothesis for questions 6 and 7. So for example, in question 9, if you were to say you think your number is 8.2, you would lose points, because you can see here that first you said your ecological is smaller than the world average and the US average, and then if you were to go on and say it's larger than the world average or the US average, you would lose points. Does that make sense? All right, so that's all you have to do for those questions. And then it's pretty simple. Then you just go over here.
Okay, so for the question now, it says think about your answer. Since the world to be in US average 7.46, so I gotta do a number between those.
No,
Not between those two, but like in that area, like a number in between.
definitely not. Nor for some people, yeah, but not for you, because you said here you think your average is smaller than the world average, right? If that's the world average, it's got to be smaller than that. If you told me here that it's smaller, then you need to be smaller than that.
Smaller than the world average.
Yeah, since that was your answer to question 6, then question 9 we need to match that. Same.
So for question 9, I gotta do my world average, like how I see the world and the US.
No.
Two numbers.
Glad you asked. So no, we're talking about you. Like, you're gonna do this calculator, you're gonna calculate how big your ecological footprint is. It's gonna give you a number and all that, all these things, right?
Where?
You're gonna do that after. This is the hypothesis.
Okay.
So we're gonna figure out what your ecological footprint is. And what we're saying is, if the world is 2.58 and the US average was 7.46, then then you choose a number. What do you think your numbers would be? And what I'm saying is, since you said your world, you think you have an ecological footprint that's smaller than the world average, and whatever number you choose has to be smaller than the world average. That makes sense? And then the same concept for question 10. Like, if you think your ecological footprint is smaller than the world average, then that means your Earth overshoot day should be sometime after the world average. Does that make sense?
I can just do a random date
Yep, like I said, as long as
between that or July.
after.
After July?
Yeah, because do you
Oh,
remember?
yeah, I heard you.
Yeah. Okay. The Earth overshoot day is like when we used all the resources for the year that were produced in a year. So if you're using less than most people on Earth, which is what you're saying in question 6, then that means we won't run out of stuff until afterwards. And then the other ones are pretty simple, like, between these things, which one do you think contributes most? Like, do you use more food, shelter, mobility, goods, or services? Just choose one. Tell me why you think that is. Then again, next question is the same thing, except which one is the least? Food, shelter, mobility, goods, or services. And just say why you think that is. Like, for example, if you lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that had no heat, no air conditioner, I would say, oh yeah, shelter accounts for the least in my footprint because I live in a 1-bedroom apartment with no heat, and no air conditioner, something like that. And then, so once you've done all the hypotheses, that's where I think it gets pretty easy. You just go to this website, and it's gonna ask you a bunch of questions.
So I can say because I have to do what you said.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, you wrote those points for that, but
I would,
you would not lose points for that, but think about it, like, if you're really gonna give a good answer, you'd explain why is it, you saying food is the most at least for you?
least,
Okay, so why is it that you
no,
don't?
shelter.
Okay,
I don't. I didn't have to struggle for a shelter.
and remember, so again, so if we're talking about ecological footprint, especially in this part, it doesn't matter like how much it costs. You know, if you live in a $5,000 or 5,000 square foot home, to pay less for it than somebody who lives in a 1,000 square foot home. Even though you're paying less, you still have a big ecological footprint. Does that make sense? Because it's all about like how much resources does it take to give you a place to live versus the other person. Same thing with food, right? So in the military, for example, people get food for free. They don't have to pay for the food, but if they're eating a lot of it, meanwhile you have a college student who's broke and they have to pay for their food, but they don't eat a lot because they don't have a lot of money. The person in the military has a bigger ecological footprint as far as food is concerned because they're eating a lot. Doesn't matter who pays for it. They're eating it. It's resources. You know what I mean? So keep that in mind for when you answer those questions.
Yeah, I said shelter.
Okay. And again, those are just hypotheses, so you're not going to lose points for it. But yeah, if you think shelter is the least of your ecological footprint, then just explain why and then answer it, and that's it. But anyway, once you're done, you're going to go to this thing.
Because you said having, like, even though I don't pay for it, doesn't matter.
Right. Because think about it. We're talking about the ecological footprint, right? So we're talking about the resources of the earth to support the resources. Right. So it doesn't matter who's paying for it. Like if you there's resources that it took to build your house or wherever you live to build that and to maintain it, like the electricity, the water, and the gas, all that stuff. And it's the resources that keep you in shelter, regardless of who pays for it. So it doesn't have to be exact, you know, just saying like, do you think, like, think about all the resources that it takes to feed you. Think about all the resources it takes to give you a place to live. Think about all the resources it takes for you to get from place to place. That's right. Transportation. Yeah. That's just saying like, which one of those do you think you're going to use the most? You know? So again, using this example, if you lived in a really tiny place that ate a lot of food, for me, if I was answering that question, I'm like, yeah, shelter is the least of mine because I live in a very small apartment. And if it was a food thing, like if you ate a lot of food, you could say, I think food, because I snack all the time, you know. Or like for some people, I think transportation would be my number one because I commute to school every day and drive 2 hours a day, you know. Just think about your life and choose which one you think you use the most of and which one you think will replace that.
So question 12. And it's, oh, so like, you just answered that question.
Yeah, but that for question 12 was asking which one is the least. Question 11 is which one is the most.
Oh, 90%. You said least at first.
I was talking about both of them at the same time. Sorry about that. Sorry for the confusion.
So obviously, what's goods and services?
Goods is like when you buy stuff. So if you go shopping a lot or you got a lot of clothes, like my wife, she should say goods because if you go into our closet, she's got clothes everywhere. There's tons and tons of clothes. Or me, I guess I got a bunch of music stuff. Stuff that's goods. Services would be like, you know, you go to the movies a lot. You stream a lot of things, you know, use a lot of internet, whatever. So goods are tangible stuff that you can hold and own. And services is just almost just that thing. Things you do. I don't know, like if you go to an amusement parking lot, that would be services.
I said food, but I said.
All right. So that's it for the hypotheses. Oh, yeah.
But they actually about my income, or it doesn't care, right?
I don't remember if you will or not, but
I mean, that,
yeah. So, you know, at the end of it, again, it's gonna tell you what your ecological footprint is and the number of Earths. I'm gonna tell you what your ecological footprint is, excuse me, as far as like the size of land that we need. It's gonna tell you when your Earth overshoot day is, which you use the most, which you use the least. So then based on all that, which kind of questions do you think the calculator is gonna ask you to figure it out? Yeah. All right, and then once you go to the website, basically what you're after here is you're gonna need a screenshot that looks like this. Right, you want this screenshot. This is what it's gonna look like. Whoop, wrong screenshot, sorry. Here we go. You're gonna go to the calculator, you can answer a bunch of questions at the end of it. It's gonna give you your results like that, but you need to take a screenshot. Of course, if you do it here, you can just show me you don't need these screenshots. But yeah. Once you click that link, it'll take you to the website. You just click where it says take the first step and answer all those questions.
oh, let's see. What do I remember? Okay, so I gotta like book skills.
Yeah.
Answer these questions.
Okay,